There were no retirement parties in the Rocky Mountains. The men who carved the American West out of raw, bleeding wilderness did not get parades, gold watches, or peaceful final chapters fading into a cinematic golden sunset. The frontier did not hand out happy endings. It was a brutal, unforgiving meat grinder of geology and hostile territory that demanded a massive daily toll in blood, bone, and human sanity. For over a century, Hollywood and dime store novelists have aggressively sanitized the legacy of the American mountain men, painting them as invincible, stoic heroes who conquered the wild and rode off into the glory of the horizon with their rifles resting easily on their shoulders. But the gritty, unvarnished truth hiding beneath the mythology is far darker, incredibly violent, and infinitely more fascinating. When you strip away the romance, you find a world where the margin for error was mathematically zero. A snapped twig, a sudden drop in barometric pressure, a wet primer pan on a flintlock rifle. Any of these minor inconveniences resulted in a rapid, agonizing death. Some of these legendary men were cut down in violent, sudden ambushes that lasted less than 60 seconds. Some were betrayed by the very indigenous tribes they had lived among, married into, and fought alongside for decades. And other Chardon men who had survived close-quarters combat with grizzly bears, endured apocalyptic blizzards that froze their horses solid, and walked thousands of miles across uncharted, hostile territory were ultimately killed by the most mundane, invisible, and humiliating enemies imaginable. Today, we are permanently stripping away the campfire tall tales and the silver screen lies. We are digging deep into the raw, historical dirt to uncover the exact, brutal, and meticulously documented details of how 9 of America's greatest frontier legends actually met their end. We are dissecting the final, desperate moments of men like Jedediah Smith, Hugh Glass, John Colter, and liver-eating Johnson. This is not a fairy tale of the Old West. This is the blood-soaked, disease-ridden, and frost-bitten reality of manifest destiny. Welcome to the true story of how the West was won, and how its greatest, most resilient heroes were ultimately lost. You are watching Frontier America. Chapter 1. Jedediah Smith, the Phantom of the Cimarron. To understand the death of Jedediah Strong Smith, you must first understand that he was an absolute anomaly in the wild. While the vast majority of the 19th century mountain men were hard-drinking, illiterate brawlers who spent their trapping fortunes on whiskey and women at the summer rendezvous, Smith was a devout, highly educated, and eerily quiet man. He traversed the deadliest landscapes on Earth, carrying a Bible in one hand and a heavy, .53 caliber Hawken rifle in the other. He survived things that should have killed him 10 times over, possessing a pain tolerance that bordered on the supernatural. His physical resilience was legendary. He famously survived a horrific, unprovoked grizzly bear attack in the dense brush of the Black Hills. The massive predator had pinned him to the earth, its jaws closing entirely over his head, violently ripping his scalp off and leaving his right ear hanging by a single, bloody thread of cartilage. Bleeding profusely and deep in shock, Smith did not panic. He calmly directed a terrified, shaking companion to retrieve a needle and heavy thread from their kit, and physically instructed the man on how to sew his face and scalp back together in the middle of the wilderness without a drop of anesthetic. He survived. He became the first American to travel overland to California, surviving the blistering, hallucinogenic heat of the Mojave Desert. He survived ruthless, coordinated massacres by the Mojave and Umpqua tribes that wiped out his entire expeditionary parties. He was a survivor of the highest, most elite order. But the frontier is ultimately a game of mathematical statistics, and even the most hardened, brilliant veterans eventually roll the wrong number. By the spring of 1831, Smith had achieved the impossible. He had survived the fur trade and actually retired. He had made his fortune, sold his shares in the trapping company, and bought a comfortable brick townhouse in the civilized streets of St. Louis. He was 32 years old, wealthy, and safe. But the psychological pull of the West was a relentless gravity. When his old friends asked him to help finance and lead one final massive wagon train down the Santa Fe Trail, a highly lucrative but notoriously dangerous trade route cutting through the Southwest, Smith could not resist. In late May of 1831, the wagon train entered the dreaded Cimarron Desert, a brutal, sun-scorched wasteland straddling the hostile borders of present-day Kansas, Colorado, and Oklahoma. It was an exceptionally dry year. The party completely ran out of water. Desperation and madness quickly set in as the heavy draft oxen began to collapse and die of thirst in the suffocating 100-degree heat. The men were drinking the blood of their dying mules just to keep their throats from swelling shut. Smith, acting as the lead scout and refusing to let his men die, rode out alone into the shimmering heat mirages to find a waterhole. Following the dry, cracked earth of the Cimarron River, he finally found a depression in the sand. He dismounted, tied his horse, and began desperately digging down into the riverbed with his bare hands until the cool, muddy waters slowly began to seep up into the hole. But as the legendary mountain man bent down to drink, the dead silence of the desert was broken. He was suddenly and completely surrounded by a highly mobile hunting party of Comanche warriors. There was no parley, no attempt at negotiation, and no warning. The Comanche were the absolute masters of the southern plains, and they saw a lone, heavily armed white intruder kneeling in their territory. Realizing instantly that he was trapped and cut off from his horse, Smith didn't raise his hands in surrender. He knew exactly how this would end. The accounts of what happened in those final 60 seconds come directly from the Comanche themselves, relayed months later to Mexican traders in the plazas of Santa Fe. Without a word, Smith raised his heavy rifle and fired from the hip, instantly killing the Comanche chief. In the immediate chaotic retaliation, as the smoke cleared, a Comanche warrior on horseback rode past and drove a heavy iron-tipped lance straight through Smith's back, piercing his heart and lungs. The man who had survived grizzly bears and trackless deserts died choking on his own blood in the sand. His body was left to the unforgiving sun and the scavenging prairie wolves. His remains were never found, his bones scattered by the wind. The only absolute proof of his death was his custom-made pistols and his silver-mounted rifle, traded by the Comanche in the markets of Santa Fe weeks later. Hugh Glass, the Revenant's Final Rest. If you know the name Hugh Glass, you know the legend of the bear. In 1123, while acting as a hunter for the Ashley Henry expedition, Glass was mauled to the absolute brink of human death by a protective mother grizzly bear. His throat was torn open, his back shredded to the ribs, and his legs severely broken. Left for dead by his terrified companions John Fitzgerald and a young Jim Bridger who stripped him of his rifle, knife, and supplies, Glass awoke in a shallow grave. What followed is the ultimate American epic of survival. Glass crawled, limped, and dragged his rotting, gangrenous body over 200 miles through hostile, uncharted territory. He survived by eating rattlesnakes raw, letting maggots eat the dead flesh from his back to prevent infection, and fueling his broken body entirely with a burning, psychotic desire for revenge against the men who abandoned him. But the movies and the legends never show you what happened after the credits roll. Glass did catch up to the men, but he didn't kill Fitzgerald. He realized killing a U.S. Army soldier would result in his own execution. He forgave the young Jim Bridger because of his youth. And most surprisingly, after crawling out of the jaws of death, Hugh Glass didn't leave the mountains. He went right back to work. The sheer tragic irony of Hugh Glass is that a man who survived the absolute worst violence that nature could possibly inflict upon a human body eventually succumbed to the very human threat he had successfully avoided for over a decade. 10 years after the bear attack in the bitter, freezing winter of 1033, Glass was employed as a meat hunter for the garrison at Fort Union, a remote trading post located on the freezing, windswept banks of the upper Missouri River. The surrounding territory was actively and violently hostile, and multi-generational vendetta against American interlopers. In the absolute dead of winter, when the temperature was hovering near 30 degrees below zero, Glass and two companions ventured out onto the thick, frozen ice of the Yellowstone River to hunt bighorn sheep. The river was a wide, flat expanse of blinding white ice, offering zero cover. They never saw the ambush coming. A massive war party of Arikara warriors, heavily concealed in the frozen, snow-covered brush along the elevated riverbank, opened fire with a devastating volley of musket balls and arrows. On the slick, exposed ice, there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Glass and his two companions were cut down in seconds. The Arikara descended upon the ice, scalping the men, violently mutilating their bodies in accordance with their warfare rituals, and stripping the corpses of every piece of valuable gear. They vanished back into the blowing snow, leaving the legendary Hugh Glass to freeze solid on the ice. In a chilling, almost poetic echo of his past, the only reason the men at Fort Union knew for certain that Glass was dead was because months later, a group of Arikara warriors rode into a neighboring trading post, trying to pass themselves off as friendly Minnetonka Indians. A sharp-eyed veteran trapper noticed that one of the warriors was carrying a very specific, custom-made flintlock rifle, It was the exact same rifle Hugh Glass had crawled 200 miles to recover from the men who abandoned him 10 years prior. The Revenant had finally been put into the ground, permanently. Chapter 3. John Colter, The Irony of the Quiet Death. John Colter was the original quintessential mountain man. A hardened, disciplined veteran of the famous Lewis and Clark expedition, Colter looked at the civilized world of the East and decided he wanted absolutely no part of it. When the expedition returned to civilization, Colter chose to stay behind in the untamed, brutal wilderness. He became the first known person of European descent to enter the strange, geothermal region now known as Yellowstone. He returned to the trading posts with wild, unbelievable reports of boiling mud pits, rivers that smoked, and exploding geysers, reports that the civilized public mockingly dismissed as hallucinations, dubbing the region Colter's hell. But his most legendary, superhuman feat of survival occurred in the fall of 1089. While trapping beaver in the Three Forks region of Montana, Colter and his companion John Potts were suddenly ambushed by a massive war party of hundreds of Blackfeet Indians. Potts panicked, shot a warrior, and was instantly hacked to pieces, his body turned into a literal pincushion of arrows. The Blackfeet, however, recognized Colter as a legendary fighter and decided to make a cruel, sadistic game of him. They stripped him completely naked, took his weapons, his boots, and his gear, and pointed him toward the open prairie. They told him to run. What followed was Colter's run, a desperate, agonizing 5-mile sprint for survival across a rocky, uneven plain densely covered in thousands of razor-sharp, prickly pear cacti. Colter ran entirely barefoot, the thorns shredding his feet to ribbons. He was pursued by hundreds of elite, highly conditioned warriors. Colter ran so violently hard that blood began to gush from his nose, covering his chest. As his lungs burned and his body reached the absolute point of biological failure, he realized one warrior had vastly outpaced the others and was preparing to drive a spear through his back. Colter suddenly stopped, spun around, and spread his arms. The exhausted warrior, caught off guard by the sudden halt, stumbled and fell, his spear snapping in the dirt. Colter snatched the broken iron-tipped half of the spear, drove it through the warrior's chest, and continued his sprint. He dove into the freezing, rushing waters of the Madison River, swimming under a massive jam of floating logs and hiding in the freezing, dark water with only his nose above the surface, while the Blackfeet searched the banks above him for hours. Naked, freezing, severely bleeding, and starving, he walked 300 miles over 11 grueling days to reach the safety of a trading post. Colter survived the absolute terrifying extremes of human endurance. The entire Blackfeet nation couldn't kill him. The freezing, sub-zero Rocky Mountain winters couldn't kill him. Absolute starvation couldn't kill him. But the tragedy of John Colter is the ultimate heartbreaking anticlimax of the American frontier. After surviving the unsurvivable, Colter's nerves finally shattered. He had had enough of the blood and the ice. He returned to Missouri, married a woman named Sally, bought a quiet farm, and settled down to live a peaceful agricultural life far away from the shadows of the mountains. In 1812, just 2 short years after escaping the Rocky Mountains, Colter contracted a severe case of jaundice. He lay in a warm, comfortable bed, surrounded by the absolute safety of civilization, and quietly died of liver failure. The man who physically outran an entire tribe of warriors, the man who conquered the Rockies barefoot, was effortlessly defeated by a microscopic disease in his own home. He was buried on a quiet bluff overlooking the Missouri River. Decades later, his unmarked grave was lost forever, dug up and destroyed by the shifting dirt and the industrial progress of a railroad being built over his bones. Chapter 4. Old Bill Williams, The Frozen Secret of La Garita. William Shirley Williams, universally known across the frontier simply as Old Bill, was a walking enigma, a former itinerant preacher who had painstakingly translated the Bible into the complex Osage language. He eventually abandoned civilization, religion, and society entirely to become one of the most eccentric, solitary, and hardened trappers in the history of the West. He was a master of native languages, preferring the company of the Ute and Osage tribes over white men. He rode a notoriously ugly, bad-tempered mule, walked with a strange, hunched gait, and survived for decades in the deepest, most isolated and freezing ranges of the Rockies. He was a man who seemed more myth than flesh, but his final chapter is steeped in bitter controversy, horrific starvation, and a disastrous, ego-driven mistake made by another man. In the brutal, apocalyptic winter of 1848, The famous explorer and politician John C. Fremont hired Old Bill to guide a massive expedition through the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. Fremont's goal was to prove that a year-round winter railroad route through the Rockies was possible, a venture driven purely by political ambition. Old Bill, looking at the sky and feeling the barometric pressure drop, vehemently warned Fremont that the winter snows were already too deep and that the high-altitude route was absolute suicide. Fremont, arrogant and desperate for glory, ignored the veteran mountain man and ordered the expedition forward. The expedition marched directly into a whiteout hill and became permanently trapped in the unforgiving La Garita Mountains in what is known to history as the Starvation Camp. The temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. The men froze in their sleep. The 120 pack mules froze solid where they stood, and the desperate, starving men quickly butchered and ate them. When the mule meat ran out, the men began to die. Then, the surviving, desperate men resorted to cannibalism, eating their fallen comrades just to keep their internal fires burning. Fremont, refusing to take responsibility for the disaster, blamed Old Bill Williams for intentionally leading them astray, a charge that historians fiercely debate to this day, though most agree Old Bill was simply following the commander's suicidal orders. Old Bill Williams miraculously survived that hellish winter and made it back to a settlement, but he had left all of his valuable traps, gear, and baggage buried deep in the snows of the high camp. To a mountain man, his gear was his livelihood. The following spring, in March of 1849, the 62-year-old veteran rode back up into the thawing, muddy mountains with a companion, Dr. Benjamin Kern, to retrieve their lost property. They were never seen alive again. Weeks later, a search party ventured up the trail and found their bodies. They had been sitting around a small, smoking campfire, likely drinking coffee and resting, when they were ambushed by a band of Ute warriors. The bitter irony is that the Utes were a tribe Old Bill had lived with, traded with, and fought alongside for years. He was considered a friend to their nation. But the Utes had been enraged by a recent, highly unprovoked and brutal attack by the U.S. Army in a neighboring valley, and they were taking blind, immediate vengeance on the first white men they found in their territory. Old Bill Williams, the master of the wilderness, the man who spoke their language flawlessly, was shot in the back and killed instantly before he could even utter a word of greeting. Chapter 5. Jim Beckwourth, the Poison Chief. James Pearson Beckwourth lived a life so incredibly vast, violent, and theatrical that historians spent decades trying to separate the actual man from his own towering mythsmiths. He happily propagated in his own exaggerated autobiography. Born into slavery in Virginia, Beckwourth was freed by his white father, headed west, and transformed himself into a legendary fur trapper, explorer, and highly feared Indian fighter. But his most defining, legendary chapter occurred when he was captured by a war party of the Crow Nation. Instead of torturing and killing him, an old Crow woman claimed that the dark-skinned Beckwourth was actually her long-lost son, who had been stolen by a rival tribe years ago. Beckwourth didn't just survive his captivity among the Crow, he actively embraced it and thrived. He became a highly decorated war chief, adopting their customs, taking multiple wives, and leading massive, devastating cavalry raids against the Crows' sworn enemies, the Blackfeet. He became a living legend among the Plains tribes. In his later years, after participating in the chaotic California gold rush and running a remote trading post, Beckwourth's reputation was called upon by the U.S. Army. They needed him to act as a scout and an emissary to the Crow during the rapidly escalating Indian Wars of the 1060s. The frontier was changing. The era of the mountain man was dead, replaced by the relentless march of the cavalry and the railroad. Beckwourth was an old man now, deeply respected but caught agonizingly between the advancing American military machine and the native people he considered his true family. In the fall of 1866, Beckwourth rode into a massive Crow village in Montana to negotiate a peace treaty and prevent a looming war. He was welcomed as a returning hero, while in the village partaking in a massive feast held in his honor, the robust, seemingly healthy old man suddenly fell violently ill. He began bleeding profusely from the nose and mouth, collapsing to the floor and suffering agonizing, crippling stomach cramps before dying in immense pain shortly after. The official, sanitized military report stated that the old scout simply died of natural causes, likely severe hypertension or a massive stroke brought on by age and altitude. But the dark, enduring legend of the frontier tells a completely different, deeply psychological story. According to the whispers of the time and the oral traditions of the plains, the Crow elders recognized that the era of freedom was ending. The white man was coming in unstoppable numbers, and their way of life was being systematically erased. They deeply revered Beckwourth. They believed his presence brought them absolute luck and invincibility in battle. The legend states that the Crow intentionally hosted the massive feast in his honor and quietly slipped a lethal dose of native poison into his meat. They didn't do it out of hatred, malice, or anger. They did it out of a desperate, twisted, and profound love. They poisoned their greatest war chief so that his spirit would be permanently bound to the Crow Nation, ensuring that his ghost would forever protect their hunting grounds and that he could never leave them for the white man's world again. Chapter 6. David E. Jackson, the Forgotten Tycoon. When we close our eyes and picture the classic mountain men, we envision rugged, solitary individuals living entirely off the land, clothed in greasy buckskins, completely divorced from society. But the frontier was not just a wilderness, it was a massive, ruthless corporate enterprise, and David Edward Jackson was one of its most hardened, brilliant CEOs. Jackson was a managing partner in the legendary Rocky Mountain Fur Company, operating alongside famous names like Jedediah Smith and William Subbolt. While Smith was out exploring deserts and getting mauled by bears, Jackson was the man who kept the brutal logistics of the company flowing. He spent freezing, isolated winters in the deep, snow-choked valleys of the Rockies, managing trappers, negotiating with hostile tribes, and securing the highly lucrative beaver pelt monopoly that fueled the fashion houses of Europe. The stunningly beautiful Jackson Hole, Wyoming, is named in his direct Honora permanent geographical testament to the grueling years he spent surviving in its bitter, sub-zero isolation. Jackson survived the hostile tribes. He survived the freezing cold that routinely snapped the limbs off lesser men. He survived the crushing, cutthroat financial panics of the fur trade. He made a massive fortune, eventually leaving the freezing Rockies to enter the highly dangerous, high-stakes world of the Santa Fe trade, driving massive herds of mules and wagons across the blistering deserts of the Southwest. But exactly like John Colter, the violent wilderness couldn't kill Jackson, the invisible rot of civilization did. By the late 1830s, his incredible physical health began to rapidly fail. Decades of sleeping on the frozen ground, enduring extreme thermal weather shifts, and pushing his biological limits to the absolute breaking point had completely destroyed his immune system. He retired to the civilized town of Paris, Tennessee, seeking rest, recovery, and the comforts of his wealth. In the late winter of 1837, the rugged corporate tycoon contracted typhoid fever, a dirty, waterborne bacterial disease that ravaged the crowded, highly unsanitary towns of the 19th century. The disease caused severe intestinal hemorrhaging and a boiling fever. The man who commanded hundreds of men across the deadliest landscapes in North America, the man who gave his name to the most majestic, pristine valley in the Rocky Mountains, died in a sweaty, foul-smelling bed in Tennessee. He was utterly forgotten by the modern world that built its vast cities and interstate highways squarely upon the trails he had bled to blaze. Chapter 7. Kit Carson, the choking end of a legend. Christopher Kit Carson is arguably the most famous, heavily documented frontiersman in American history. He was the quintessential scout, small in physical stature, soft-spoken, but possessing a terrifyingly lethal reputation that made hardened killers cross the street to avoid him. He guided John C. Fremont across the uncharted Rockies, fought with brutal distinction in the Mexican-American War, and served as a highly decorated Union officer during the Civil War. He was a ruthless Indian fighter who later became an Indian agent, executing the brutal, scorched earth campaign and the forced, deadly relocation of the Navajo people, known to history as the Long Walk. Carson was a man who lived his entire adult life by the barrel of a gun. He survived hundreds of intimate, close-quarters skirmishes and massive battles where the air was literally thick with flying arrows, musket balls, and artillery shrapnel. He seemed to possess a supernatural immunity to violence, but Kit Carson did not die in a blaze of glory. He did not fall in battle. He died by slowly, agonizingly suffocating on his own blood. In 1860, while on a remote hunting trip in the San Juan Mountains, Carson was leading his horse down a steep, treacherous mountain trail. The massive animal suddenly lost its footing, slipped, and violently tumbled down the ravine, completely crushing Carson beneath its immense weight. Carson survived the crushing impact, but he sustained massive, unseen internal injuries, specifically severe trauma to his chest, neck, and cardiovascular system. Deep inside his throat, an aortic aneurysma ballooning of a weakened blood vessel began to slowly, inexorably grow. As the years passed, the aneurysm swelled, pressing heavily against his windpipe and vocal cords. For 8 grueling years, the legendary scout slowly choked. His booming voice was reduced to a raspy, painful whisper. He could barely eat. By the spring of 1868, he was a frail, dying shell of a man living at Fort Lyon, Colorado. His beloved wife, Josepha, unexpectedly died from complications of childbirth, an event that completely broke Carson's legendary will to fight. A month later, on May 23, 1868, as Carson was resting in his quarters, the massive aneurysm finally ruptured. As his lungs rapidly filled with his own warm blood, Carson knew with absolute certainty that the end had finally arrived. He didn't panic. He didn't ask for a priest. According to the attending army surgeon who was frantically trying to save him, the grizzled frontiersman looked up, asked for a thick, rare buffalo steak, and requested a final pipe of strong tobacco. He managed to take a few slow puffs of the pipe, looked at his friend, whispered the words, "Doctor, compadre, adios," and died. Chapter 8. Joseph Meek, the sheriff of the end of the world. Joseph Meek was the flamboyant, incredibly loud, and larger-than-life character of the Rocky Mountains. While other trappers were brooding, deeply suspicious, and solitary by nature, Meek was notoriously boisterous, wildly humorous, and incredibly dangerous in a fight. He once fought hand-to-hand with a massive grizzly bear, surviving only by repeatedly stabbing it in the face. He took multiple native wives, lived like a king during the summer rendezvous, and survived the absolute golden age of the beaver trade with a permanent grin on his face. But as the 1840s approached, the silk hat replaced the beaver pelt in high European fashion. Overnight, the bottom fell out of the fur market. The mountain men who had lived as lords of the wilderness were suddenly forced to adapt to a changing world or starve in the mountains. Meek chose to adapt. He abandoned his traps and led one of the very first major wagon trains over the treacherous Oregon Trail, settling down as a farmer in the fertile Willamette Valley, but the wildness never left him. When the brutal Whitman Massacre occurred in 1847, where enraged Cayuse Indians slaughtered a group of white missionaries, including Meek's own young, mixed-blood daughter Meek transformed overnight from a wild trapper into a grim man of the law, seeking justice and federal protection for the isolated settlers. Meek rode completely across the continent in the dead of winter, enduring blizzards and hostile territory, to arrive in Washington, D.C. Still dressed in his greasy, ragged buckskins, he boldly walked into the White House to personally beg President James K. Polk, whose wife was actually a distant relative of Meek, to make Oregon an official federal territory, as Marshal of the Oregon Territory. He personally organized the manhunt, oversaw the trial, and physically threw the lever to hang the Cayuse warriors responsible for his daughter's horrific death. Meek didn't die by the gun, the arrow, or the hangman's noose. He simply ran out of time. After decades of incredibly hard living, freezing winters, vicious political battling, and enforcing the federal law at the absolute edge of the known continent, his massive, battered frame finally gave out. In June of 1875, at the age of 65, the Merry Mountain Man died of a simple, debilitating stomach illness at his quiet homestead in Oregon. He died in a soft bed, in a civilized state that he had personally helped create with his own blood and sweat. He was a wild man who was ultimately completely domesticated by the relentless march of the civilization he had dragged across the plains. Chapter 9. Liver-Eating Johnson, the Final Indignity. John Jeremiah Garrison Johnston, famously known across the frontier as Liver-Eating Johnson, and immortalized by Robert Redford in the sanitized Hollywood movie Jeremiah Johnson, is the subject of the bloodiest, most terrifying myth in the history of the American West. The dark legend states that after a Crow War party murdered his pregnant Flathead Indian wife, Johnson embarked on a solitary, years-long psychopathic vendetta against the entire Crow Nation. The stories claim he killed over 300 Crow warriors in hand-to-hand combat, deliberately cutting out and eating their raw livers as an ultimate terrifying insult to their spiritual beliefs. The actual historical reality is slightly less cannibalistic, but equally gritty and violent. He was a massive, terrifyingly strong man who stood over 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds of raw muscle. He was a former sailor, a Union soldier who deserted his post, a whiskey peddler, a woodcutter, and a highly ruthless Indian fighter. He absolutely did fight a brutal personal war against the Crow. And he likely did simulate eating a liver on the battlefield once just to completely terrify his enemies, earning him the grisly moniker that followed him to his grave. But the tragedy of liver-eating Johnson is the tragedy of a man who severely outlived his own era. As the 20th century rapidly approached, the wild, untamed frontier was systematically paved over. The great, thunderous buffalo herds were slaughtered to near extinction. The fierce native tribes were broken and forced onto desolate reservations. Johnson found himself an unwanted, violent relic in a modern world of telegraphs, steam trains, and polite society. He tried desperately to adapt, working for a time as a deputy sheriff in the rough mining town of Red Lodge, Montana. But his massive body, broken by decades of freezing weather and savage combat, rapidly deteriorated. Penniless, destitute, and suffering from severe dementia and failing internal organs, the once terrifying giant of the Rockies was placed on a train by sympathetic townsfolk and shipped to a Veterans Administration medical hospital in Santa Monica, California. The man who had roamed the vast, pristine wilderness of the Rocky Mountains spent his final pathetic days wandering the sterile, brightly lit halls of a modern hospital. His mind was completely lost to the past, staring blankly out the windows at the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by the noise of a rapidly industrializing city. He died there in January 1900. The ultimate, most feared mountain man didn't die in a blaze of glory on a snowy peak. He died in a massive bureaucratic medical facility in Los Angeles. His body was unceremoniously buried in a crowded veterans cemetery, completely surrounded by the modern concrete, noise, and smog. He had spent his entire life trying to escape. The frontier didn't just kill these men. It consumed their youth, broke their bodies, and shattered their minds. And when it was finally done with them, civilization marched in and paved over their graves.